The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman by Laurence is an absolutely bizarre book. It feels really postmodern, even though it is in fact a piece of 18th century literature. Everything appears to go wrong for Tristram Shandy at the beginning of the novel, which, by the way, Tristram isn't even born at the beginning of this novel. Tristram states that, "I wish either my father or my mother, or indeed both of them, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, had minded what they were about when they begot me." So the first problem is that Tristram Shandy's parents weren't thinking when they were having sex, when they conceived him. This novel also technically begins with a sex scene. It goes from bad to worse in Tristram Shandy's mind. There is a slight obsession around noses. In fact, there is a story about noses. There is a chapter on noses in this novel. Because when Tristram's born, Dr. Slop actually delivers Tristram with forceps, and as Tristram is coming into this world, Dr. Slop breaks Tristram's nose with the pair of forceps. All of the conversations around the nose actually make the reader question whether the nose is just a nose and whether it is not a phallic symbol. Everything is a phallic symbol. But the narrator Tristram tells the reader it is definitely a nose, even though you may be thinking that it's not a nose because it sounds like it's not a nose. I am still talking about a nose. Tristram is aware that the reader is going to read double meanings into everything that he says, and it creates, as Wolfgang Iser says, a game for the imagination. Throughout the text, Laurence leaves blank pages that he lets the reader fill with their own thoughts. Those 2 blank pages that I've just shown you, he actually addresses in a later chapter. For how was it possible they should foresee the necessity I was under of writing the 25th chapter of my book before the 18th, etc. So I don't take it amiss. All I wish is that it may be a lesson to the world to let people tell their stories their own way. Tristram Shandy is a non-linear narrative. He is constantly making digressions and telling you to go back a page because he doesn't think you've read it properly, so he thinks you might need to go back to another chapter just to make sure you understand what you're reading. Laurence also uses blank chapters and blank pages in this novel to actually encourage the reader to use the imagination. For example, Tristram's uncle Toby is in love with Widow Wadman. Tristram Shandy is aware that each reader will visualise Widow Wadman differently, so he encourages the reader to actually get a pen and draw Widow Wadman. To conceive this right, call for your pen and ink. Here's paper ready to your hand. Sit down, sir, paint her to your own mind, as like your mistress as you can, as unlike your wife as your conscience will let you. And then he leaves some paper for you, so you can draw her. There actually appears to be a dialogue between the fictional writer Tristram, or the actual writer Laurence and the reader, because they actually respond to what the reader has drawn. Laurence not only leaves gaps in the text through actual blank pages, there are asterixes all over the pages of Tristram Shandy. These asterixes are used to cover vulgar words. Consequently, the reader is actually left to fill in these gaps with their own vulgarity. There is also a strange marble page in Tristram Shandy, which I'm not quite sure what that means, but when this book would have been published in the 18th century, they would have had to create each marble page differently. So I don't know whether that means that because Tristram Shandy is a game for the imagination, that every reader will understand Tristram Shandy differently, just the same as perhaps this marble page will be different in each edition. That's why Tristram Shandy really fascinates me, because you're never quite sure what it means, but you know it means something, but the fun is to try and understand what it means, and it is complex and it's fun, and it can be annoying because you'll be reading and suddenly he'll say no, you need to read it again, and it really feels like the fictional writer Tristram is just making it up as he goes along, and that's a wonderful experience. Because normally when you're reading, you start at the beginning and you end at the end, but Tristram Shandy is certainly not like that. Tristram Shandy knows that most novels go in a straight line with no digressions. These illustrations by Tristram show all the digressions in the volumes. Tristram doesn't want to tell his story in a tolerable straight line. He wants to tell it with all these digressions, and as a reader sometimes that can be difficult to follow. But digressions are in life. Life is in a way one big digression. And in fact it is the way I think that we talk and we speak. When I'm telling a story to someone, I don't normally start right at the beginning and then end perfectly. I always end up going, in fact, to understand this, you need to know this, so I'll tell you this story first, and then we'll go back to this story. And Tristram Shandy has just put that on paper. Personally, the plot of Tristram Shandy actually isn't that interesting. It is just a story about Tristram Shandy and his family, but it is comic. But what is really ingenious is the non-linear structure of this text. These are the last lines of Tristram Shandy. Lord, said my mother, what is all this story about? A cock and a bull, said Yorick, and one of the best of its kind I ever heard. A cock and a bull basically means that Tristram Shandy is nonsense. It's bullshit, to be less polite. And I think that's the point of this book, is that it means something, and at times it can be serious and quite emotive and poignant, but ultimately it's just a game, and it's just there to make you smile. But it is just a masterpiece. A very confusing, wonderful, frustrating, ingenious masterpiece.